The global insurance industry is more than a market.
It's a movement powered by 3 million professionals around the world.
Together, we support communities as they rebuild after disaster.
Help businesses through risk and uncertainty.
Protect individuals as they plan for brighter futures.
This impact isn't possible without people.
That's why we attract, grow, and retain the very best talent.
Because when every voice is heard,
When every person feels they belong.
We don't just build careers.
We build a better tomorrow.
Belonging builds 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 belonging builds
Belonging builds tomorrow.
Hello everyone, hopefully you can all hear me, and welcome to Dispelling the Myths, Trans Allyship in the Face of Mistruths. I hope you're all having a good diving festival. This is now my probably 4th year of attending events, and I heard we kicked off with a bang yesterday, so hopefully we can keep that energy going, and we'll get to it. So I'm going to introduce myself and the panel. If this is going to work. Yes, thank God. So my name is Maxim Cook. My pronouns are he and they, which means I use them interchangeably, and you can refer to me as he or they. It differs quite a lot throughout my life between personal and professional life, but either is fine. I am co-chair of Link, which is the LGBTQ insurance network, and have been for about 3.5 years now. Alongside that, I work in company secretariat at Tokyo Marine Kiln, and I've worked there for 5.5 years. But this event is not about me, and I will hand over to Jude to introduce themselves.
Thank you so much. My name's Jude Guaitamacchi. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a trans and non-binary award-winning campaigner, a keynote speaker. I am also an activist and the founder of an organisation called Trans Solidarity Alliance. We're a non-profit in the UK, and we are very much at the forefront of working towards the rights and equality of the transgender community here in the UK. And I have run quite a few different campaigns as well, online, virtually, social media campaigns such as Trans Youth Are Loved. And I run projects and initiatives centred around supporting trans youth, for example, Trans Secret Santa UK, which is just launching again this year. But I'm a very passionate activist, campaigner and speaker. Thank you, that's me.
Hi, I am Robyn Newark. So I am the co-chair of AIG UK's Out Plus network, which is our LGBTQ plus employee network. I also do social media work under Robyn Talks Trans on Instagram, where I basically try to sort of debunk things, share kind of news and keep people up to date on what's going on for trans people, to ensure that people are kind of learning from a trans perspective rather than sort of getting all of their sources and all of their information from perhaps areas which maybe are a bit biased. By day, I work as a fraud investigator for AIG, so I do background searches on people in respect of insurance fraud, so things like slam-ons, so people intentionally slamming their brakes on to try and claim whiplash, things like that. So really excited about today. I'll hand back to Maxim briefly, just so we can move forward.
Thanks, Robyn. Maybe I'm in the wrong career in insurance. A fraud investigator, it sounds like a really fun job. I forgot to say thank you actually to all of our sponsors for this event, and obviously to Jude and Robyn for making this event as well. So thank you to AIG and BMS, and then I can't really thank Link because it's thanking myself, but I guess thanking myself as well, and to Lee Thomas from AIG, who's very helpfully given us all the support in the background and helped shape this event as well. So we're going to go through our learning objectives today. I sound like a teacher. Number one is understanding our trans identities and history in and outside of the UK and across the globe. Number two, by the end of the event, you should be have an understanding around dispelling myths around trans identities, of which you would probably have seen a lot in some certain media publications, maybe not so much in some others. Number three, by the end of the session, you'll be able to understand how we connect generational gaps of knowledge on gender variance throughout the years. And finally, number four, understand how to support trans colleagues through allyship, which is probably the juiciest part of our session today, and as a section that I would hope that most people will be on this call for as well. So I'm going to leave it to Robyn and Jude now to speak through all of these, and we'll see you in a bit.
Thanks, Maxim. So we've got the sort of start is defining what it is to be transgender. I know we spoke yesterday, Jude, and you had some interesting stuff. So I don't want to step on your toes. Maybe if you want to lead that part, and we can go from there.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to understand that we trans people are all different, just like everybody else, right? That meaning of what it means to be trans to us can be personal. The definition that it's understood is that a trans person is somebody whose sense of gender identity does not match or correspond what's phrased as the sex they were assigned at birth. But I have a bit more of an updated definition myself. I see it more as your gender not aligning to the gender that you were assigned at birth or before birth. For example, I was assigned a girl when my mum went for an ultrasound, and I'd say that for me, when it came to being assigned that gender, my mum said, great, well, I'm going to call her, assigned me a pronoun, and then gave me a birth name, which I don't disclose. Many of us in the trans community describe that name as a dead name. But let's just say it was a traditional girl's name. So before I was even born into this world, who I should be was decided for me. But my mum also didn't stop there. She painted my bedroom pink. She bought me dolls to play with. And she had plans to take me to ballet class as soon as I could walk. So this whole sense of identity was kind of laid out before me, and I didn't have a say. And I just didn't match up to that. There was something that didn't fundamentally fit. But I think for many of us, that's the case, right? We're assigned this identity, whether you're trans or not, and we kind of break out of those sort of gender roles, so to speak. Girls might start to play football and do things and stay true to themselves. But that feeling of that, the meaning of being trans is much more than that. It's not just about gender roles. It's about this discomfort, this just mismatch between the gender that I'm assigned versus who I actually am. And that can become more prevalent as well during puberty for some trans people, not necessarily all. So when the body changes, for example, that for me was a time that I really struggled. And yet you ask a trans person, have you always known? And some people will say yes. I, for example, had no idea, although that experience was there. As soon as I understood that I was trans much later in life, I was able to pinpoint that experience as always having been there and never being able to put my finger on it, and I don't know what your experience was of that was, Robyn.
Yeah, very much the same, to be honest, Jude. So I will say I've had a sore throat, so you have to bear with me. Just before I get into that, I do have a little chat message from Maxim. We have questions in the corner, so if anyone wants to ask anything, we will have some questions at the end. So scan the QR code if you can, and you can ask stuff there. But yeah, my experience was much the same. It was start of 2021. I kind of came to the realization that I'm trans, and since then I've kind of looked back, as we all do, and it's there's been a lot of times where I've thought, okay, that makes sense now. Now I understand why I felt that way. Now I understand why I use the term queer, which some people maybe are not aware of, has kind of regained its meaning for us within the community as a kind of broader term for sexuality and gender and all sorts. So I had always had this sense of I'm queer, but I don't know how. And I just, that was always there, at least for me, above sort of everything else. And I kind of look at it as like, I think my body was expecting certain hormones that weren't there. And I've never really aligned, or I never aligned with what it is to be a man or a boy. But but equally, I don't think I ever stereotypically fit into, you know, what it is to be a girl. I grew up playing with like Star Wars figures and video games and stuff, which stereotypically we say, oh, those are boys' things, but they're not, you know. And sort of back to what you're saying about sort of birth, we very quickly place a sort of, we learn the sex of a baby, say a boy, and then parents, you know, stereotypically are like, okay, great, he's going to play football, I'm going to get him to learn to play guitar, I'm going to, you know, he's going to be a mechanic, all this kind of thing. And it's like, but that you're placing all of these gendered expectations just purely on this one factor, when anyone can do these things. Yeah, and I guess one thing that comes out of it for me is a kind of common question is, well, why can't you do all of those things but still be a boy or still be a man? But it goes beyond that, you know. It's not just the things I do, it's who I am at my core. The same as, you know, someone who is gay knows that they are gay. For me, it's the same for being trans. I know what I am, and the actions that I do don't really change that. Perhaps that's something you relate to, Jude. I don't know, but that's how I kind of see it.
Absolutely. And I feel like the experience of gender is so individual, you know, who you are to yourself. So when people throw around the question, what makes a woman? I don't believe it's for anyone else to decide, particularly a man. Ask the woman herself, because actually so many cisgender women have different experiences of what that means to them. You know, so many people feel discomfort with the word lady or man, whereas others embrace it. And that just reminds me of hearing a trans person talk about, you know, their pronouns and what feels comfortable to them. So actually, if we really ask ourselves these questions, they're going to be individual from person to person. And that kind of brings us on to the next question, really, doesn't it, when it comes to beyond the binary of us as human beings, but in this case, biological sex.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we consider that, so around, I believe the statistic is around sort of similarities to redheads is how many intersex people we have, and that gets so lost in the discussion, and essentially that amount relates to, from memory, sort of roughly the population of Russia. And so how do we just, as a society, we seem to just ignore this mass population of people and just say, well, you're either male or female, nothing else exists. But that's just not true. You know, and the existence of intersex people proves that in terms of our biology. You know, and then we move on to sort of gender and our own experience of our own internal self. And, you know, we've got bits later to sort of talk around the history of that. But, you know, I think as a society, we're kind of slowly moving away from this kind of notion, which is kind of misogynistic, of like women should do this and men should do that, and those being the rules. And actually, people don't really fit into those categories either, despite what you might hear. I suppose we had a slight introduction about ourselves, and for yourself being non-binary, do you want to talk a little bit around that and the sort of binary gender and how you see yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, I like to dispel the myth that we as human beings are two things. There are over 8 billion people on the planet and no two people are the same, right? So that's just not true. And that doesn't just go for who we are, that goes for biology, that goes for so much more than just this sense of who we are. Like, we are diverse by nature as a human race, and intersex people are a reflection of that. 1.7% of the world's population have a variation of sex characteristics. We're talking chromosomes, hormones, internal and external organs. So if we can understand that, if we can understand there's just a whole variety of different humans, then our experience of identity is individual as well. And, you know, I've asked myself so many questions with regards to what non-binary means to me. I mean, ultimately, it's the way that I tell people that I'm Jude rather than them assuming that I'm a man based on how I look. Because, I mean, I'm so heteronormative looking. I'm one of the least queer looking people I know, whatever that means. I don't wear any colours. Like, I think this is as far as it gets. But, you know, it's interesting because I've asked myself, I thought, well, if I'd been assigned male at birth, would I still be non-binary? And the answer is yes. I would have got to a stage where I feel like I would have still understood this about myself. Of course, dysphoria is different for me. That's a separate experience. That's why, you know, not all trans people transition necessarily. You know, some people, they have this internal experience of themselves. But I was telling you yesterday, you know, all my friends are women. I'm like, no, my people. I still feel part of a lot of women's communities, lesbian communities, and that's more of like an emotional connection type of experience. And then I have the self on the outside looks like a typical bloke, and it's so interesting for me because sometimes I'm treated that way, and it's also really strange for me. I didn't come out as trans. I didn't understand that I was trans until I was 30. So I lived 3 decades of my life believing this experience about myself, believing I was a woman, believing that's who I was, and I do highlight that experience because, of course, that's sort of shaped me into who I am as well. And it's so. I mean, the fact is, I heavily believe that gender is a social construct, and because of the fact that I've walked so many different experiences in life, and I've got to this stage at the late stage of 30 and thought, well, actually, I can't just say I'm a man because I'm being told to pick a side, and actually. Yes. I'm a big believer in personal autonomy, right? That we should be able to tell people who we are rather than men telling us who we are. Absolutely. And actually, I didn't come this far to then just not stay true to myself, right? So I stand firm in that, even though people kind of ridicule that identity still. There's still a lot of unfortunately a lot of discrimination towards non-binary people. In fact, more so, I believe, the statistic in trans
often
people.
Just completely forgotten. I won't get into it too deeply here, but we had the Supreme Court ruling and all of the stuff that's happened from that, and there's no real discussion about non-binary people at all, or intersex people. So that it's a whole sort of demographic of people that I've really forgotten about. My experience, I suppose, somewhat similar to yours, sort of coming out, or I was about 35, I think. So I lived a long portion of my life, at least, as a man. And I don't necessarily regret things. I was married for 10 years, a very long-term relationship, all that kind of stuff. And I just reached a point where I was like, I need to be true to myself. Thankfully, I've had a really good experience of coming out for the most part. I've not really had too much negative interaction in person. The places I run into issues are online. Excuse me, I'm just going to cough. The place I run into issues are obviously online, especially doing what I do. That's where a lot of the trouble comes from. And that's a whole other side of things. But work, all my friends and family have been great, and some have taken time to get there with things. But for the most part, it's been probably the best thing I've ever done in my life. So I think that says a lot, at least. Maxim, do you want to move to the next slide and we can sort of keep rolling? So I guess we've got these myths. Take your pick, really, I suppose. But
well, this whole trans non-binary thing is a trend. I mean, firstly, it's this idea that people have in their heads of what it means to be non-binary. That it's this kind of youth fad thing. Firstly, I completely break that myth apart. But also. Gender diversity has existed since the very beginning of time. Like, what is it? Ancient Mesopotamia, the first gender diverse communities were recorded. Right. Like, we're talking, what is it, 200 BC? Or maybe, I can't remember. But BC, okay. Right. And there we go. So actually, the idea that gender is binary is a more recent part of our history. So if anything, that's the trend.
Yeah, and we'll get onto it in a minute. But, essentially, outside of Western culture as well, it's particularly been around for a very long time. And things like there are too many trans people now and all that kind of stuff, I suppose, ties into that, it being trendy, which it really isn't. I mean, honestly, I don't know about you, but who wants to face these kinds of political issues? Seems a bit narcissistic if that's what you're doing it for, but I suppose the key kind of myth for me is that this idea that we're mentally ill or we don't live in reality. And this is the same sort of issue that the rest of the LGBT community have faced in the past. We had, gay people were pathologized as some sort of mental illness. And that was in the 90s, I believe, late 80s, early 90s, that was removed from things like the World Health Organization guidelines, which I think is now is the ICD-10. Which is a diagnostic manual for clinicians. and so we've been here before, and it's the same now as that in the 2010s, we were declassified as a mental illness because we are just a normal variation of human existence. But people cling on to this sort of dated notion. Maybe 20, 30 years time, people will finally catch up with it. But, essentially we're just who we are. And, tying in with that, we shouldn't have to just accept our birth sex if it makes us extremely distressed and uncomfortable. And if it's just not who we are at our core, I don't, I'm not harming anyone by being myself, and neither is Jude. And I think that's a really sort of important point. Perhaps you want to take on this sort of non-binary looking androgynous.
Oh, wow. Well, again, and there was a point where I was more androgynous than I am now, and that was part of my sort of social transition as I was exploring myself.
Yeah.
But why would non-binary then equal some kind of stereotype yet again,
right,
when the whole point of reclaiming our sense of self isn't to match up to a stereotype? And often there's an expectation, and I think that actually non-binary just it's an individual experience, and to be able to kind of just decide how I want to look and dress in what feels comfortable to me, rather than seeing these as belonging to a specific gender. Like, they're not, just because I bought them in the men's section does not mean that this shirt belongs to a man or should be worn by a man. Like, it's just it's a bit of material, right? So
it's just cotton or whatever. Yeah,
it's cotton. Someone just put that label on there, and that's the point. When we kind of pull apart these stereotypes, these social constructs, it's about doing just that. It's about saying, actually, someone made that decision, and we should be allowing people to just dress in ways that feel comfortable to them without labeling that experience.
Yeah, we tend to, as human beings, we tend to like to put people in boxes. We tend to like to be like, okay, now that I know this about you, I can put you in here. And I suppose we see this in the rest of the LGBT community, the kind of stereotyping of like a gay man is like flamboyant and feminine, and a lesbian is typically like butch. Neither of those are true. But so there's always a stereotype somewhere when you fall outside of a cisgender heteronormative sort of framework, I suppose. And the things like, I can always tell when someone is trans. You definitely cannot.
That's why I challenge the whole ruling, because how are we going to police gender spaces?
Right, exactly. And this is why it harms everyone, the sort of transphobia, because you cannot always tell. Some people maybe, but even then, I think people make a lot of assumptions about other people based just on the visual kind of aspects of them.
Considering we're 0.5% of the UK population, and there are more masculine presenting women than there are likely to be trans people, just wait to see who this actually affects.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Things like trans people are dangerous, when statistically we're sort of up to 4 times more likely to be victims of violent crime and things like that. The research is there to show that actually we're the victims in a lot of the issues that are actually being projected. So I just completely sort of disagree with that kind of myth, because it's factually incorrect. I'm so much more likely to be a victim if I go into any toilet, regardless of how it's labelled, compared to a cisgender person, because of who I am, how I look, those kinds of things. And certainly, I mean, to a certain extent, I pass more than others do. So there are plenty of us that don't, and that's a whole conversation in itself.
I find it really bizarre as well, that what is it about being trans that threatens people, that makes people think, and it's because we're constantly seeing headlines with trans this, trans that. As soon as a trans person, if ever, puts a foot wrong, their identity is automatically brought into the conversation.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah, definitely. The headlines are always kind of like, trans woman does this, and and that's sort of made into a big deal. But if someone, I guess my example would be, you would more likely see a headline saying like, banker does XYZ, just as an example. and it would never say, male does this, or aggressive man does this. Yeah, it's always just their job or some other aspect about them. Whereas with trans people, it's always like trans woman or trans man does XYZ, and so that is put first and foremost, isn't it? And so people then build us this kind of idea that we're dangerous, which is just not true.
And it's purposeful as well, right? It's intentional, I have to say. With that, so it's important to sort of really critically think when we're reading anything about this community.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so and then we've got being trans is new, which I suppose we've covered a little bit, and we will go into actually might be the next slide, Maxim, if I'm remembering right. Let's have a look. Here we go. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So did you want to take some of the earlier ones? I can do the later ones.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just a wonderful reflection of how so many Indigenous cultures and communities and cultures around the world recognise gender diversity. The Two-Spirit community of the Native American culture, which is a more modernized term, but essentially they recognized people who were gender diverse, and actually they were held in positive regard. Anyone that was considered to have both the spirit of a man and a woman, so Two-Spirit, was considered sacred, like a counselor, like someone that was very wise. And so actually it's interesting because trans and gender diverse people were held in high regard in that sense, rather than condemned, which came much later, actually. But again, as well, Ghana, a culture that assigns your gender based on your anatomy, on your energy rather than your anatomy. So, your energetic self, and yet look today around the world and what we're seeing. And so much of this information about these communities was erased, and is kept out of our history lessons, for example, because so many of us grew up with Section 28, which actually prevented us from learning anything about any of this history. And I found it so enlightening. Still today, we have the Hijra community as well in South Asia. And the Hijra community are made up of transgender people, also intersex people as well. So it's this whole idea of, again, diversity within sex, diversity within gender, still prominent today. These communities still exist. And yet, why didn't I learn this growing up? And of course, later on in our history, for example, with Magnus Hirschfeld, which, the Institute of Sex Research, I mean, some of the earliest forms of gender affirming care, the first surgeries back in, the early 20th century, I believe it was 1919. But, back then, this was happening, like people were having gender affirming care, so the idea that that's more recent, and so much of their research and their literature was actually burned by the Nazis. And I have to say, I would like to draw a slight comparison in how information is being erased right now. And actually what's beginning to happen. And my fear is that this is the aim, this is the intention, right, is to move us away from the understanding of what we've always known throughout history.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Jude. Definitely, it's a pioneering work at the time by Magnus Hirschfeld to also give us sort of protections, or at least where he was situated, I think Berlin, was to actually give people legal protections to actually stop them from being arrested or worse at the time. And that's 100 years ago. We also have some other sort of interesting sort of reference points here. So sort of post-World War II, we had Christine Jorgensen, or Jorgens, I guess it's Jorgensen, who was G.I. Joe to G.I. Jane was the kind of famous line. And essentially she was she'd served in the military. She was a trans woman who post-war flew to Berlin to have all of her sort of transition-related surgeries at the time, flew back, was very heavily covered in the media. I guess I wasn't around to see everything in the day, but she seems to have been treated very respectfully at the time, at least for the most part, from what I can see. And so that was probably one of the biggest moments, I suppose, media-wise at the time, for recognizing sort of someone who has transitioned. We also have the Gallus, hopefully I can pronounce this correctly, the Gallus of Cataractonium. Got it. Which essentially was a 3rd century Roman Britain in Catterick in North Yorkshire. And basically they found, I suppose, to try and use today's language rather than perhaps how they would have used it then, was someone who is non-binary potentially, or they had been castrated, and they were buried with women's clothing and jewelry. And the theory is that they were a sort of early non-binary person in Britain. So, that's 3rd century. We've also got James Barry, who was a trans man that served in the military in the 1700s. And essentially, he was stealth. No one knew that he was a trans man. And he performed, I believe, like one of the first or the first C-section in, while serving in the military in 1789. So, and that went unnoticed by the military at the time. It was only when he passed away that they actually found out that he was a trans man. So, we go back so far, and there's so much variation in who we are. So it's certainly to debunk one of the past myths, we're not new, and we're we've been around for a long time. So yeah. Next slide, please, Maxim. Brilliant.
Media.
So media portrayal. So I can speak on a little bit of this, and if you want, you took the start of the last slide. So I suppose we've got, when we look across time, or at least sort of recent history, and how media portrays us, there's definitely been a shift in how we're recognized and how we're treated as trans people in media. So you might notice some of these, or most of these, are a little bit I'm a millennial, 38. I'm not, obviously not old, but I feel a bit old saying this. These are quite dated things now. We've got things like Psycho, so Norman Bates dressing as his mother to murder and things like that. Whilst it's not a trans character, it doesn't portray any kind of gender or anything outside of a binary gender as very healthy. It just portrays someone being insane because they're dressing up as their mum, and there must be something wrong with putting on women's clothing. Again, Buffalo Bill, Silence of the Lambs, similar. I don't believe was a trans character, but again, it was sort of pathologizing him and essentially portraying someone that is wearing a man wearing women's clothing as being horrible and wrong and dangerous and all that kind of thing. We had Friends, we had Chandler's dad, who basically was a trans woman, but they would always refer to Chandler's dad as a man, and he, him, and it was always sort of the butt of the joke. So, that's not particularly nice. We also had Rachel. There was an episode where she was claimed to be intersex, and there was this rumor that had gone around when she was in school, and people from different schools knew about her being intersex and stuff like that, as if it's a problem. I don't know if you want to take any of these at all, Jude, or if there's anything that comes up for you in these.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So you think Mrs. Doubtfire, these are the films I used to watch as a kid. I mean, I'm your age as well, right?
Yeah.
Films I used to watch as a kid, didn't blink an eye, because those were the times we were living in. I'd say hopefully we've moved on a little bit, but I remember watching Ace Ventura and the sort of the trans storyline, and what makes me think of these kinds of examples is the fact that it was all kind of negative, right, or sensationalized, or something that was traumatic or pathologized. Any kind of portrayal of trans people in the media was never a positive thing. It was always subject of ridicule, etc. And as you rightly said, intersex community as well. Whereas I'm hoping we've moved on. And actually, when we rewatching Friends nowadays, I'm like, I can't actually believe that I used to watch this show, and not question.
Some of it hasn't aged well.
Absolutely. And I just feel like that's such an example of how we as a society are kind of waking up out of our unconscious bias that we didn't realize at the time. And now actually I think it's really important to portray characters in a better way. I actually want to bring up the L word for the L word fans. We went from some problematic transgender storylines to and then actually making an apology to the trans character in the show, and I was like, that's how it's done, and making a conscious effort to be more inclusive of trans women in lesbian storylines as well. I just, I love to see that, and I was actually quite warmed by the fact that they even portrayed the kind of younger characters acknowledging they were queer and having relationships in a more uplifting way as well, where it wasn't all just about the doom. And because the old series were quite traumatic, whereas I found the newer series to be a bit more positive. And I thought, wow, okay, it's not all just about how hard it is to be queer. We can start to rewrite the way that we want to see life and people kind of progress. And and so I'd say we've definitely moved on. There's a great documentary called Disclosure that for those of you that want to watch the kind of timeline of trans representation in the media, it's a fantastic documentary that does just that, really delves into it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think actually that brings us to the next slide quite nicely. I know there's a couple we haven't covered there, but Disclosure, great. Tells the story of trans people in media. Everyone that worked on it is trans. So it's really lovely. I definitely recommend it. I think it's on Netflix. I could be wrong.
It is, I think.
And for anyone who's maybe seen it or not, Euphoria is kind of similar in that Hunter Schafer and Zendaya are in a relationship. And for those that don't know, Hunter Schafer is a trans woman. And to see actually that's just portrayed as a relationship. There are two women in a relationship. And it's not in any sense sort of honing in on Hunter Schafer being trans. There are a few scenes where you kind of see a couple of things that you're kind of, okay, now I understand a bit more, but that's not the center of it. It's just she is who she is, and that's part of it. And obviously we talked a little bit yesterday about Baby Reindeer. I don't know how you feel about that at all. But yeah, I have some mixed feelings about it personally. So for those that don't know, Terry in it is a trans woman, and she dates Donnie, who's the sort of center of the whole show. The show is essentially about him and his story. And she is a therapist. She's a strong, successful woman. She's very sure of herself and knows what she wants in life. But Donnie struggles early on because he questions his sexuality and what other people might think of him dating a trans woman. And so it's great to see her representation, her being great, but it again comes back to sort of centering how other people feel about her rather than just treating her as a human being. Which I guess is part of the issue we face, is that a lot of these stories often center cisgender people and how they feel about us rather than telling our story. Or I suppose in the sense of Barbie, there's a trans actor in it, and she just plays a woman or a Barbie. And so that I think is kind of the ideal, is just letting us be who we are and not centering things on that. And for the curious, I'll touch on the last one here. Is a game Cyberpunk 2077, and there's a character creation in it, and basically you can pick any mixture of anything you want when you create a character. Anything, removing clothes, anything you kind of want in terms of primary or secondary sex characteristics. And I guess that's just nice to see that representation in a weird way of kind of like, well, I can create who I am. Don't have to fit this mold, and it's, that's something we wouldn't have seen a long time ago. Anyway, I think maybe we are running slightly behind, so yeah, let's get to here. So this is the important bit, I guess. I'm really conscious, Jude, of the work you do.
Yeah.
So if you want to sort of start us off, and we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been working in the space of trans solidarity for 8 years. I have been part of huge campaigns such as the LGBT campaign 8 years ago to really galvanise lesbian support for trans people, because there's this whole narrative that trans people are raised lesbians, etc., which isn't true, because actually the lesbian community is increasing, believe it or not. But I've done a lot of work also in education, and just this is what I do, because I recognize that it is so important for such a tiny group of people to have allies. So, I welcome allies. I do what I can to support allies, a little bit too much, but just to kind of highlight how we define an ally. An ally is someone that advocates and supports for the equal treatment of a community other than their own. So I'm an ally to communities that I don't belong to, vice versa. And it's so important to recognize what it means to be an ally. And for me, it's about action, right? Not just words. We hear a lot of words, and it's lovely to hear vocal support. So speaking up is a huge part of being an ally, but it's not enough. It is about the action. And so I'm frequently encouraging people to think about what those actions are in their daily lives, and whether you're kind of conscious of what you say and what you ask is really important. So, am I asking intrusive questions a little bit too often? And actually, do I need to be led by the individual when asking questions? It can be a lot of pressure, people working in organizations to have to take on, firstly, their day job, but then they have to become the source of information and kind of the dictionary and encyclopedia of the trans community, and then advocate for themselves in their organization. Such a huge amount of pressure. So my suggestion is allies, get involved, be part of this with us, take some of that pressure off. Really just kind of, it's really about tapping into that sort of empathy and thinking, what is it like to be a trans person in 2025?
Definitely. Yeah, right? I agree. Like, I've had to learn so much these last sort of 3 to 5 years about my rights and everything that's going on, and to keep pace with things, and that is really tiring. It does sort of weigh on your mind, and that's work that most cisgender people don't have to do. And maybe I suppose you could say I don't have to do it, but if I don't, then there's a lot that can happen that I'm not aware of, and a lot that I can't do to combat it. So yeah, definitely speaking up, and like you say, actions, writing to your MP and things like that as and when it's needed, and joining protests, all that kind of thing. As well as that, I suppose just looking at some of these other allyship sort of points, is consider the source of the negative opinions. Where are they coming from? Are they coming from news media? Are they coming from trans people? Are they coming from people who are kind of, you'd have a very different opinion about everything else on? And actually talk to us.
And I have to say, being trans exclusive is not an opinion. It is discrimination. It's as simple as that. If you're excluding trans people and saying, well, I don't believe, I mean, we're here, we exist.
Yeah,
we're also protected from discrimination, despite what's going on.
And this is actually sort of ties in with this, if you're not sure if something's transphobic, change the protected characteristic. If you said, well, I don't think we should share toilets with a black person, then clearly, clearly that's racist. The same goes for this, and that's how I view it personally. And that I don't think there's anything wrong in saying that. Being trans, gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. So I just think that we deserve to be treated just as kindly and with the dignity that everyone else gets. And
we have human rights as well. And a lot of what's happening could actually violate those rights. So it's important to recognise that we have human rights, and trans people also have human rights. But you're right, and I think the big one for me around allyship is education as well, because I feel that a lot of people don't realise that there's this big elephant in the room, right? Fear. Fear of getting it wrong, a pronoun, a name, what's going to happen? I'll get cancelled, it will go online, my company, what will happen? And actually, to me, the answer is education. That's how we empower ourselves, through learning. And for a huge, for so many people that grew up with Section 28, myself included, with no education on any LGBT topics because we weren't allowed, because it was banned. How were you meant to know? And I always hope to ease the pressure with people and say, look, we're all on this journey of learning, ourselves included. Like, I wasn't born with the information about my identity and my community. I had to learn. I've had to also learn and unlearn how to assume people's gender. So this whole thing around pronouns, I just don't guess them for people I know anymore. I start gender neutralizing until I know otherwise, and it's a practice. That's called conscious inclusion. Steps we take.
Definitely. I know, even myself, we were having a conversation yesterday and I was telling you about someone and I was unsure of their pronouns. So I said they, and then later I slipped up and said she, and I was like, no, they. And so it's kind of, even for me, it's like, it's something you have to consciously do, and it does get easier. As well as that, I suppose, I really do want to stress this point from my perspective. I have been very fortunate, and I recognise there's a lot of privilege around this in my job for AIG, in our medical care, in our private medical insurance. We have trans health coverage. And so I've been able to access a lot of stuff through my transition, essentially at no cost. I've had to, obviously pay in excess, but I've had facial feminization surgery. I've had vocal feminization surgery, which is not going so well at the moment with a sore throat, but that's unrelated. But those are things that others do not have access to. And so if you're in a position in your job where you can actually look at the healthcare you're providing employees, providing coverage for trans people to help with their transition is immensely important. If I didn't have that, my facial surgery would have been at least 20 grand. And who has that money? I certainly do not. It's impossible for many of us to save to get these sorts of procedures. And that's also where a lot of the prejudice comes in, because people look at us, they would say, look at a trans woman who's not had facial feminization surgery and think, oh, you look like a man. And it's like, but you're not recognizing the difficulties that people face in even getting to that stage, if they even want to. It
can cost a lot of money just to be ourselves, and for a community where we're essentially being pushed out of public life, which is going to affect us in so many ways. We have to earn a living, we have to live like everybody else, and then fund however much it's going to cost for us to just live comfortably as who we are.
Exactly. I know people that have had to make a choice between a deposit for a house or gender reassignment surgery, and so they choose the surgery because it's better for them in the long run and their happiness, whereas other people don't have to make that choice. If obviously getting on the property ladder is a privilege in itself, but to even get to that point where it's like, okay, well, I can do one or the other, I can never do both, is it's heartbreaking. And so we'll sort of just wrap this slide up, as I think we're just coming towards the end of this bit. But I suppose there's a couple of things just quickly, like volunteering. You can volunteer for charities, whether they're trans-specific charities or otherwise. That is always wonderful and always helpful and needed. Follow trans people on social media, like myself and Jude, because you'll learn more from us as individuals in that sense, and educating on statistics and sort of understanding things more. Like, I can throw a few very quick things before we move on. 1 in 3 trans people are likely to be homeless at some point in their life. There's other things, like I mentioned earlier, how we're up to 4 times more likely to be the victims of violent crime, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of education out there that I'd really encourage people to sort of take part in, especially if you're following some of us on social media to learn. But yeah, hopefully that wraps that slide up nicely, Maxim. I know you had this to just talk about briefly.
Sorry, I was on mute. That took me back to 2020 when lockdown started. Hopefully you can all see me or see me soon. But of course you can see the slides with this very lovely document, which kind of flowed in nicely after your point about allyship. It's something that Link has worked on for a couple of years, 2.5 years. And quite upsettingly, we were hit with the God, I've forgotten the name of it now. The Supreme Court ruling, that disastrous thing. How could I forget? Which meant we had to change a lot of our guidance. We had to change part of our guidance, sadly. But we've re-released it, and there is an addendum now on what companies can do. So please scan this QR code if you want to get it. I'm not sure if you can see my camera, but I have a very lovely blurry copy in front of me as well. So it is also a physical document that you can have in your office, and it's designed to most likely never go out of date, although I presume it may do at some point. Thanks so much for the conversation. I kind of pride myself on someone that knows quite a lot about trans identities, but always an opportunity to learn, and I've learned a hell of a lot as well. So we'll do a quick recap on our learning objectives, and then we'll go to some questions. I've been monitoring the questions coming in, and so many brilliant questions. So we'll pose as many as we can of those within the time as well. So our first objective was to understand trans identities in history, and I think we definitely did that at the start, and I learned that 1.7% of the global population has a difference in sex characteristics, chromosomes and everything as well, and that everyone has a really different experience of gender. I think my gender identity has changed throughout the years that I've been knocking around on Earth, and when I was in my early 20s, I kind of realized that I was non-binary, and I still believe that, and it's been a journey, but everyone has a different journey, and everyone on the call will be on their different journeys as well, whether that be staying as the gender they're assigned with at birth, or transitioning, or being non-binary. Our second one was dispelling those nasty myths around trans identities, and the one that people say is trans is a new thing, and I've had conversations with people about this within my own circle of family and friends, so to learn that it goes as far back as Mesopotamia was quite astounding. And I really like what you said, Robyn. It really struck a resonance with me, and obviously you can replace the word trans with queer, or any other characteristic within the community, is that you're not harming anyone by being yourself, and I think that's very true. In today's society, you need to be exactly who you are, quite unapologetically, and that might be hard at times, but that's why we have community. Our third objective on connecting generational gaps on gender variance. I grew up just outside of Section 28, but in deep, dark Somerset, where I'm from, we didn't learn about queer identities and queer families or anything like that. So it's interesting to see that it's all being brought into the curriculum now, but we have to acknowledge that Section 28 really silenced an entire generation, if not more than one, on their understanding of what a queer identity is, or how queer people live in the world, which also would have silenced a lot of their beliefs about themselves if they were queer as well. So we understood quite a lot on the generational gaps between gender variance understanding. Lastly, on trans allyship and supporting trans colleagues, and I think a lot of the questions are around this as well, so I'll be quiet as soon as I can. We went through the allyship points. Jude, I think you said something about thinking about your daily actions, what are you doing? And I found that was really beneficial for everyone to consider that, what they're doing day to day to support trans people. Are you learning about the Supreme Court ruling? Are you learning about the EHRC guidance that is useless, that has come out over the two that they've released in this year, and the knock-on effect which it has on companies and businesses as well? And are you speaking up for trans people, whether they are there or not? And you're completely right, you have to do a lot of learning around identities and terminology. I wasn't born understanding about it. I didn't get taught it at school. I taught myself, and I went out with people and got to know them and their identities, and I made the mistakes, and I misgendered someone by accident, and I learned from it, and it's totally okay to do that if it comes from a good place, and it happens to the best of us. Robyn, I think you said that you had done it as well to someone, so it's something that happens across the board, I think. If I move on, we will get to question time. I don't know if you can see the screen anymore with the QR code, but we've had a lot of questions come in. You have to excuse me, I'm going to do it from my phone. And I'll pose, I think maybe we have time for 2 or 3, maybe 4, and any others that are unanswered. We have another slide after this that you can direct your questions onto as well. So either Jude or Robyn, how do you handle negative attitudes towards trans people, with people who are close to you and that you can't just cut out? This person seems to be having regular arguments as they cannot stay silent.
That's an interesting one. I suppose it depends. I suppose there's a couple of sides of it. It depends. Is this someone like a family member that you live with, or is this sort of someone who you get to spend time with and then disappear from, kind of thing, which is a very different sort of scenario, I suppose. For me, my experience, I would say my parents were confused for a while, and it's taken them a long time to come around, but they're great now. But when I came out to them, I was met with, well, when I grew up, men were men and things like that, and the misgendering and the dead naming and stuff like that. And so I had to distance myself from them for a while, and I had to say, you know what, I need a break from you, and that's okay to do if you can. I suppose it's very different if you're living with someone in that situation. I don't know, Jude, if you have an experience or anything to sort of add to that, or.
Well, I wanted to let you speak, I guess, because I've been quite lucky in the sense, well, I don't have an enormous family, but my mum was very accepting. She's kind of been on a journey as well, where she, because it is tough. I mean, I'm trying to think about how the question is asked, whether it's an ally asking, how do I challenge someone that's close to me, or a trans person sort of around that. And as a trans person around that, I mean, I've had to make some difficult choices with family members where I've had to put in boundaries and I've had to sever ties, and it's not an easy thing to do. But if somebody was on transphobic and continued to be, that might be something that I would have to do. And that's why it's so important to have chosen family within this community. So many of us do, because family rejection is so common and it's heartbreaking. I did a lot of work in schools, and the children used to say, how do I come out to my family? And I said, I can't tell you, I can't advise that, because it might not be safe to. But what I can say is that stick with the people around you who support you, who love you, and if you've got friends at school, etc. So chosen family, hugely important. And if it's an ally and you're wanting to challenge someone's negative attitude, I mean, I think it's commendable to try. I think it's always great to challenge with, you know, the factual information, and as an ally, that's a great thing that you can do. But also, don't waste your time if it's not being heard. It's just a waste of time. And look at other ways that you can be an ally, without necessarily having to constantly have arguments with people who just don't want to hear it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, definitely.
I think as well, going back to what was mentioned earlier, you have to check the sources of where these people are getting their information around trans people from, and where that then shapes their view of trans people, when I can guarantee quite a few of them will never have met a trans person in their life and already assume. Running out of time, so another question for either of you. I recently came out and started my transition. I haven't told anyone at work, and I know that everyone's timeline is different, but when is it common or safe to share?
Wow, yeah. When you feel ready, is be my answer. And no one's going to know that until you know, the only person that's going to know that is you. I guess I knew for about 18 months before I came out of work. And that's when it felt right to me. And when I also just felt like I can't keep coming to work and separating myself at the door, you know, having to get to work and think, okay, now I need to leave all of that outside of work and go in and get on and pretend I'm someone else. Anything to add, Jude?
I'm going to kind of, because I think that you're probably the best person positioned to be able to answer that question, considering that I am trans for a living. But what I do want to say is kind of answer the question for actually everyone else listening, because there was a statistic. It was, what was it, 2021? Total Jobs did a survey, and it found that 2/3 of trans people hide their identity at work, and that to me indicated that the majority of workplaces just aren't welcoming enough, perhaps, or feeling safe enough for trans people to actually bring their true selves to work. So for any organisation, for allies wanting to be allies in the workplace, I think it's really important to think about how we can facilitate that space. Like, what can we do to make it a more welcoming, more trans-friendly, more kind of open space where people feel comfortable enough to bring that part of themselves to come out? Because, bring authenticity drives innovation, drives productivity. Like, people being themselves at work is so important. So this is also for the business, but please go with the empathetic part first. And then, I think for everybody else listening, that's really something to think about too.
Yeah, for sure. I know we are at time, so if we're able to just show the screen again, hopefully there is opportunities for more questions, Robyn's Instagram, Jude's website, and then a whole plethora of link QR codes that I had the joy of making as well. If you want to find out more about what we do and link, and we have our specific trans and non-binary group as well.
Yep.
So I'm sure any one of us is happy to answer questions that you have. I'm sorry we didn't get through as many. There's obviously never enough time with Dive In at all. So there is another slide that just says thank you, and I won't put that up. I'll leave these up so you can scan and use them at your heart's content. But I just want to say a big thank you to Jude and Robyn for sharing your stories and your journey, your experience, and hopefully we've been able to not change people's minds, but encourage people to be more of a better ally for trans people. And whether you're starting on your allyship journey or if you're quite the way through, thank you for being with us, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Maxim. That was lovely.
Thank you all so much.